the panel and the discussion today, just so that you know, only the presenting aspect. So to get us started today, as I said, we have a lot to cover. There are 3 different modules that relate to this class 4 session. So we'll get started with cross-cultural communication and team management, and then later in the session, we'll move on to project tracking, and then wrap things up with some discussion on training design. So as I said, welcome to everyone. I'm so glad to see that everyone has made it into the final class, meaning you're very likely going to get your certificate for part 1 of the GAIN training once you complete your post-training survey. As you all likely know by now, I'm Anne Green with the Institute for Global Health. And for our first session today, we're going to dig into cross-cultural communication to get started and really explore some of the challenges that come with that. We've got some exciting aspects of this presentation, but as I said, we have a lot to cover. And so as we go along, feel free to put any questions in the chat, but also note that some of the concepts that I'm introducing today, we will cover in part 2. They're just meant to be kind of an introduction to get you reflecting on these areas, and then we'll go in further depth in future sessions when we have a little more time to dig just a little bit deeper. So for this first module, just to give you an overview, we're going to cover some fairly vast concepts. To get us started, I want to just review some of the topics that we covered before in relation to research administration, and those concepts presented in the first 2 modules of this training. And then we'll move on into cross-cultural communication and those challenges, including a panel with some of our colleagues that we've invited to join us today. And then to wrap up this first module, we'll get into team management, both within your own institution and with international partners. So this is just a review slide here that you might remember from Holly's presentation in class 1. And I just wanted to kind of bring us back to this notion of the overarching goal for research administrators, which is really to support research development at your institution. And, as we discussed, research success is often found in that connection and collaboration between 2 paths. This area of research development and all of the efforts that go along with that, collaborating with the work of the research administration team. So you see this Venn diagram, and we'll come back to that throughout the GAIN training in part 2 as well. Some of the scope of a research administrator's role is listed out here. Obviously, we all know it's not limited to just this, and we acknowledge that some of you may not perform all of these tasks, while others may take on all of these and more. What's most important is that everybody on your team understands their role, what's expected of them, and really trusts the faculty and other team members that they work with. So to further reiterate some of the earlier concepts, I just wanted to highlight back to this previous slide where we talked about building bridges between PIs and research administration staff, and how much of your role as a research administrator is about balancing the needs of the research scientists and the compliance and regulatory needs of the institution and sponsor. And since our session earlier this month on this, I really hope that it has sparked some further thought about the connections within your team, how you work together, and how things might even improve moving forward. So a lot of what we're covering today is going to expand on this notion of building bridges between team members. And we're going to delve a little deeper into related aspects of this as we get into cross-cultural communication. So when navigating your role, taking on all these tasks that we've covered in training thus far, engaging with team members within a variety of levels at your institution and also internationally, there is often this circumstance where cross-cultural communication impacts your work on a daily basis. And that could be a positive impact, a negative impact, but certainly it's something that I think all of us working in different countries with different cultural backgrounds that we're all facing. You know, we hear that phrase a lot, cross-cultural communication, and some of you may even be wondering, like, what exactly are we getting at with that? And I thought it might be helpful to just take a step back and think about what is culture, you know, and what do we actually mean when we refer to cross-cultural communication? You know, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about culture? You can just put this in the chat. There are no wrong answers, but what does culture mean to you? What is your culture, in your opinion? Everyone, please feel free to put in the chat. I can't see if people are responding, so maybe if someone can just share some of the responses.
Daphne says it's your framework of thinking, your cadre, the environment and practices that we grow up with. That's Beatrice.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, you know, culture, there are a lot of definitions out there, and it can mean a lot of things to different people. I will say that Oxford, trying to get this definition to pull up for you. Oxford defines culture as the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. And examples include all of the things that make up a way of living, right? This includes our codes of manners, the way that we dress, our language, our religion, our rituals, our art, and even more, you know? And so all of these aspects can really affect the way that we work together and we work between team members, especially those who might be living in other countries. Part of your homework assignment included a video managing cross-cultural remote teams. And there were several examples provided of the challenges when working between different cultural backgrounds and different locations. So it's just, these are just some of these challenges, obviously not an exhaustive list here, but some of the aspects of our cultural background and communication styles that can impact our work performance and how it is perceived include challenges with speaking different languages, having different communication styles, and we're going to come back to this in just a minute. Our different attitudes towards conflict and how we might help find resolutions with that, different approaches to completing tasks, different decision-making styles, different attitudes toward disclosure, different approaches to knowing, different beliefs, different concepts of time, different structure of systems altogether. All of these differences that can relate to our cultural background can really impact how our work progress goes, you know, and how things flow as a team. So now I'm going to come back to that communication style. Another part of our homework to prepare for this session involved taking a quiz, and I hope you all had the time to do it. I appreciate that it was a paper-based quiz, and so if you were working from the PDF, it was a little challenging to keep track and get your scores right. And if you didn't have a chance to actually do it, I encourage you to find the time, either print it out, to get your own communication style. I found the process really interesting to see what my results were. But so the quiz that we took was based on Pierre Cassie's Revisiting Communication and his model that describes 4 different kinds of communication mindsets. So each of these styles, the action mindset, process mindset, people and idea mindsets, all of these communication styles can be used to effectively communicate. But when we understand our own communication style, as well as those of the team members that you work with, it really can help you navigate your communication differences when managing your projects. You know, individuals with the same communication style will most likely have the easiest time communicating with one another, whereas team members with different communication styles might need to make some adjustments to have the most success with working on a project together. So in the next few slides, you'll see a breakdown of these communication styles that are listed here. And I want you, especially if you didn't have a chance to take the quiz beforehand, I just want you to try to take note of the different characteristics listed and see if you can find which ones you think you most identify with. And for those of you who took the quiz, you know, maybe finding your communication style that was the most dominant and see if these characteristics really describe your working style, your communication style. So the first one that you see here, the action-oriented communication style or change-oriented style, tends to focus on the types of items that you see listed here, like results and objectives and performance. Oftentimes these folks present as being very down-to-earth, direct team members, while process or organization-oriented communication styles tend to focus more on facts and procedures, often presenting with a systematic, kind of step-by-step approach to communication. These are the other 2 styles. The people or teamwork oriented communication style tends to focus on team needs and motivations, often presenting as spontaneous, empathetic, warm team members. And idea or innovation oriented communication styles tend to focus on concepts and creativity, often presenting with an imaginative, charismatic, potentially even difficult to understand approach to working. And so you'll have these slides to go back and read this in depth. And I apologize if the text is a little small here. But you know, I just think that taking this time to reflect on your communication style, but also those of the people that you work with can be really helpful. So just briefly, we're going to have a quick breakout here, keeping these communication styles in mind and reflecting on your own responses to the survey if you took it, and those dominant communication styles that were listed in the quiz itself. We're going to break into small groups and discuss these questions that are listed here. And I am not able to paste these questions into the chat, but I wonder if someone from the group could, just so that you have them to reflect back on when you're in your breakout session. So this is sort of an open floor for discussion. These questions are just meant to really spark the communication on what you find your communication style to be. So Hillary is going to help get us into our groups here. And then we'll try and get these questions in the chat so that you can follow along when you're in there. These will be just smaller groups that you'll see.
I just put them in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Donna. And we'll have about 10 minutes once we're in our breakout group. So please feel free to hit the ground running with your discussion because, you know, as I said, today's class is a little packed, but we definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, how you kind of identify your own communication style or those of your team. And also if you agree with the results of the quiz, if you took it. I was a little surprised with my results, but you know, as I thought about it, it made a lot of sense for how I work.
All right, I'm about to launch. Make sure you click join the room.
The group. And we really want to hear from everyone. So today we have Marina Figueiredo, a research program manager with Report Brazil. Thank you, Marina, so much for being with us today. We also have our very own GAIN member, Daphne van der Ven from the Aram Institute in South Africa. And then also, last but certainly not least, we have Usman Woodil with the Vanderbilt Institute for Global Health. And so they've, as I said, they've all joined us to just really kick off the discussion. We want to hear from all of you, but to get us started, I would just like to ask each of our panelists to please, one by one, share an experience with us that they've had with cross-cultural communication breakdown. Sometimes these challenges with cross-cultural communication can result in a breakdown of communication where things maybe don't go as planned because of those influences. So Marina, I think I'll let you get us started if that's okay. We'd love to hear from you, and then we'll move on to Daphne and then Usman.
Sure. So I just want to talk a little bit about my role, because I think my situation is a little bit different. So I've been in the US for 11 years, but I'm originally from Brazil. And so my native language is Portuguese. And so all of my projects are in Brazil. So I've been very lucky because, I don't have any cultural barrier or language barrier. But I can totally see how things can get lost in translation. So when we are talking with our colleagues in Brazil, sometimes they have a different understanding of a simple email, or, they would complete a form in a different way that I would do. And so these little things, sometimes they, just a simple deadline that it's, it's different than what I understood. Not that I understood correctly, they did incorrectly, but it's sometimes it's tricky to make sure we are all in the same page, but mostly because of language, I think. And so this happens a lot with meetings like this, especially with lots of people. I feel like they feel much more comfortable with an email where they can read the email and have time to digest and interpret the whole thing. But in meetings like this or in phone calls, that's when usually we get lost. Things get lost in translation. And so
Absolutely.
we've had some situations where they would go crazy about a deadline that didn't exist. I'm like, no, it's not for tomorrow, we still have time. Or I'm supposed to do this. No, you're not supposed to do that, don't worry. So I think having this, I feel like I do a lot of bridging to make sure we're all in the same page and having the same interpretation, especially with the sponsors. Because that's when, people get very scared about it. But like I said, I've been lucky because I speak the same language. I'm the same, from the same country. But even with that, there are things that happen that things can get delayed a lot because of those little things. And so I don't have a specific example that I can give you, but it's in my daily basis, those, little miscommunications that we are always trying to.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the point, right? Is that it's almost impossible for it to not impact our daily work, And so just the more we can be mindful of it. Daphne, what are your thoughts?
Oh, can you guys hear me? Yeah, I don't know if you can see me. That is one bad picture of me, by the way. Can you see me all right? No.
Yes.
Oh, you can. Okay, sorry. Anyway, I can't see myself. So the first thing that came to mind when you put the question to me, it wasn't so much of a breakdown, and it's more of a in the personal sphere. But so I'm from the Netherlands. I've lived in South Africa for about 20 years now. Sorry, I said 10, but it really is 20. And when I arrived in South Africa, and after a while, whatever, I got into a relationship with somebody in South Africa, with my then partner. And I introduced him to my family and all that sort of stuff, and it was all good. And then the first time that he came with me to the Netherlands, he saw my cousins again, and he commented like, "Oh wow, you're looking so well, you've gained weight." For my Dutch cousin was like, "Oh my God, that's such an insult. You don't say that to somebody, right? That you've gained weight." But for my South African partner, that was a big compliment, because it means that you're doing well, you're doing, you're
healthy,
able to provide for yourself, and you're healthy and all that. So he really meant it as a compliment, and it was received as an insult. So, and look, and that was all just quite quickly resolved, and it's not like it turned into anything ugly or whatever, but it was such a typical thing of like, oh my gosh, if you're not open to kind of, if your mindset is not one of, let's approach each other with an open mind, and you immediately go, oh my gosh, what was said now, these things can go bad, obviously.
Absolutely.
And in terms of, I can think of actually so many examples where it's those little things. One of the things, like in NIH RFAs, or whenever in the instructions on how to, the instructions are written in American English, and with all due respect to Americans, that is a particular type of English, right? For sure. So then they write about a 1/2 inch margin. That is like, to me, what is 1/2 inch margin? Is that 1/2 an inch margin? Is that 1.5? Is that 1 inch? What is that even? It
right.
It's stuff like that. It's like, oh my gosh, it really takes you to check what is actually meant here.
Right. And I'm sure, you you learn what is meant by that. But something even that might seem so small in formatting can lead to your submission
Yeah,
not being accepted. You know,
absolutely.
that
Yeah.
from the American perspective, we can really take for granted, you know, and really fail to see sometimes these cross-cultural communication challenges and things.
Yeah,
Example, I think that is a great example of just something, you know, so small that can have a really large impact if
yeah.
good. So I really appreciate that. For the sake of time, I'm going to share on with Usman.
Sure.
Usman, would you like to add something to the conversation?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to say most of my experience, I think, reflects or is similar to that of Marina's. I've been here for some time now and been originally from northern Nigeria, and I'm lucky that most of my projects, or almost all of them, are in northern Nigeria where I come from. So I'm kind of familiar with the culture and people's behaviors over there. Yeah, but still, once in a while, you tend to face some, problems or some communication issues. I would say they are not, it's not, I would not describe it as like a communication breakdown, but mostly as ineffective or poor communication, so to speak, because of the, nature of the people over there. What I have observed, and I think many have observed, is that people from that part of the world,
I think Usman froze.
I know, I was trying to see if that was from my end. Maybe while we get Usman back, I would like to open it up to our GAIN participants. Does anyone have a question? You can either raise your hand to ask your question directly, or you can put it in the chat. I can't see the chat at the moment, so if others can.
I'm watching it, but there's nothing in it yet.
Okay. Well, maybe just, oh, is that a,
Adonai has his hand up.
okay. Please continue. Adonai. Are you there?
Okay, let's move to Leonard. He said he'd like to make a contribution.
I'm here now.
Yeah, can you get me?
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes.
So can I speak now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say that it is crucial that we work with our peers and our colleagues, our team members, with understanding. Understanding is very crucial to success. People have differences in personalities, culture, communication styles, and what have you. We must just know and realize that because of differences in where we were brought up, differences in our realities, people will be different. And my opinions, the way I see things, they don't have to be the right way. I must be able to accommodate other people's styles, their uniquenesses, and their differences. Recognizing this is seriously going to help in how successful we are in our teams. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. And I think really the root of all of this needs to stem from a mutual respect, right? On the next few slides following the panel, I kind of lay out a lot of tips for how we can really respect our differences and work together. Leonard, did you have something to add?
Yes, in this part of the world, you know, we have different languages, and most times our L1 influences what you want to say in the L2, which is the English language. So, so it is good for you to understand the context of the situation or the context of the person you are communicating with. Because as somebody said rightly, like I can imagine I traveled for the first time and the immigration officer was asking, he had this, I think Australian accent, did you come in to die? I understood, did you come in to die? And he was asking if I came in today. So I told him, no, I did not come to die. I came to survive. And before he said, no, I mean, did you come in today? So most times, again, as I said, your L1 influences your L2. So you might be saying something and it might be misconstrued by another person because of your accent or what. And then the other issue is the context of the situation. What you might be saying to somebody in the UK, he has a different context, might not be applicable to somebody in this part of Africa. Let us say, for example, you are talking about something dropping through the roof, right? And in order for you to access it, where I live, you have to remove the zinc to access. In other places, it might be a tile. You have to remove the tile to access the roof. So if you say that in my own country now that you have to remove the tile in order to access, in our own context, we don't have tiles on our roof. So these are some of the challenges. So it is good, you know, the context in which the person lives, the kind of culture and whatsoever, and then that will guide you on how you are to communicate with that particular person.
That's right. That's right. And thank you for sharing that, because, you know, I do really feel like so much of the frustrations that can be felt, you know, when working cross-culturally really relate to a lack of understanding, you know, on someone's part, and really trying to learn about those differences and respect those differences can go a long way. So I'm looking in the chat here and I see that Simbiri had asked about some of the barriers in communication. So I know that some folks on the panel had given some of their examples of the breakdown, but are there any other barriers that anyone would like to add, in addition to some of those that have been mentioned, like the obvious language barriers, you know, that have existed, and some of those examples there. You know, Daphne shared maybe we'll just call it a cultural barrier in relation to commenting on someone's weight, you know, and what might be socially acceptable to comment on. Is there anything else someone would like to add? And it doesn't have to be on the panel either. Anyone in the group can share. We have just a few more minutes.
Can I just add something that came to mind?
Absolutely.
You know, there are local things that are very different from, you know, country to country. For example, taxes. Taxes in Brazil is a nightmare, even for Brazilians to understand. You can imagine, you know, people from other countries. And so for a grants management standpoint, taxes is a nightmare for any analyst. Effort tracking, it's something that, you know, at least in Brazil, people don't usually do it. They just do it for grants. And so there are these local things that, aside from the language, they're also very different. And then I think we need to try to understand their context.
That's right.
You know.
I saw in the chat that Awal would like to make a comment. Awal, are you with us?
Yes, please. Actually, when discussing with Jolo, we're looking at the categories of the indicators that will actually say whether you are a reflector or you are a pragmatist or you are a theorist. But all behind that is one example you are assuming and you have people of different culture and also background that you are needing to actually get to a target. You cannot be definite to be, say, you are a pragmatist or you are a reflector, but the situation will actually determine which style of leadership you are going to apply. And just like we had of taxes also, taxes, the general economic situation that you face in that particular environment will also determine the kind of leadership style you are going to adopt, and then how you can get your team to really understand your goal and how you can get along with them. So that's a great comment I wanted to make.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Awal. I totally agree. And I think maybe for the sake of time, I apologize that we had to have such a brief panel because I feel like honestly, we could use the rest of our session today to just talk about, some of these challenges. But I'd like to move on into some of the solutions for how to address these challenges. So I invite the panelists to stay with us for just a few more slides in case that sparks any additional conversation here. And get these slides to advance here. So I've listed out here, again, not an exhaustive list, but just a few tips to help us really bridge some of these challenges in cross-cultural communication. These, again, just are a few slides highlighting tips to improve our communication and ultimately serve as a reminder that as we work together, it's important to strive to learn from generalizations about other cultures. But don't use these generalizations to stereotype or oversimplify ideas about another person. So much about this is really related to practicing mutual respect, practicing taking the time to learn about another team member's culture or why they may have phrased things a certain way, or ask questions if you don't fully understand, why someone might be doing a certain thing. Definitely not assuming that there's one right way to do this. The communication style quiz really demonstrates that all the styles are good styles of communication. They just have different attributes to them. A few other tips here. Not assuming that breakdowns in communication occur because people are on the wrong track. And that's what some of our comments already were getting at, that it generally relates to a misunderstanding and not that someone isn't trying to get their work done in the best way possible. They're just coming at it from a different perspective. So the more we can listen actively and empathetically and really respect others' choices about how they choose to communicate with you can go a long way. And then just a few final tips here. Really, when you find yourself feeling frustrated, practicing stopping, suspending your judgment and trying to look at the situation from another perspective. Being prepared for a discussion of the past and something that might have happened a long time ago that has influenced your interactions at the moment. This is also a big one that we haven't really touched on yet, but having an awareness of culture, of current power imbalances. I think as someone mentioned in the comments, our education levels can also impact this, but also culturally in different places, hierarchies can exist. And sometimes it's not mirrored in another culture. And so, I know even within having this class, I'm sure that we have gone against certain hierarchies that might exist within your institution or your culture. And, you know, we just always ask that we operate from a place of patience and understanding. And I know that I can speak on behalf of the directors that we're always open to receiving feedback. If something was offensive, or if you feel that certain aspects maybe weren't seen, you know, and then ultimately realizing that, you know, cultural norms might exist for a reason, but they might not apply to the behavior of a particular individual. We're all very different. And I know in the breakout group that I was in, we really got into the fact that few people are just one particular communication style. We all are this mix of a little bit of people and a little bit of action, and you know, just finding where you are in the mix, maybe which one is more dominant for you, you know, and just continuing to operate from respect ultimately. And on that note, before we move on to the next section, I just want to thank again sincerely our panelists for joining and sharing some of their experiences. And so before we move on to team management, just one last opportunity for any quick questions that folks might have. Not seeing any burning questions come. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I don't seem to agree with that culture are not apply to the behavior of any particular person.
Sorry, I might have missed part of that. That you want to agree or you don't agree with that one?
I don't seem to agree with that the
Okay.
culture are not meant. I think it does. It does.
Yeah, I think that, you know, it honestly is open to interpretation. What I think that it's getting at here is saying that within a culture, even though it might be the norm, you still could find people within that area that don't feel that that norm, you know, so maybe they find that they're a little bit different from the cultural norm, you know, on average, maybe most people exhibit a certain behavior, but not everyone has that, you know, is what I think it's getting at. Just pointing out that people can be different. Not every American is the same, has the same, you know, stereotypical American mindset. But thank you for that, because yeah, all of these are really just suggestions, and they certainly are open to interpretation. So with that, we are going to move right along for the sake of time into team management. And this might happen a few more times today where it feels like we're kind of jumping into another section. But as I said, you will all get these slides at the end, and there is still part 2 of GAIN training. And so we'll return to a lot of these themes that we're introducing as we go along. So please bear with me if you feel like I'm going too quickly. So we've talked a little bit about your roles as research administrators, and we've touched on some of the potential challenges and some tips or solutions for approaching cross-cultural communication and breakdowns that might happen in that communication. And now I'd like to move our discussion into team management and the impact you can have on team effectiveness. A lot of us might underestimate just how much influence we can really have on the people that we work with. And of course, this varies depending on the context that you're working in and which level of the team that we're considering. I know some of you may work with a whole lot of other team members, and for others, it might just be you and a principal investigator that you're working with, and maybe one partner in the States. But ultimately, coworkers' support or the lack thereof can influence the perceptions of their own role, work attitude within your workplace, and individual effectiveness among those around them. So despite any of these existing hierarchies that might exist institutionally or even culturally, the organization and support you can provide to your team can really have a huge impact on the overall successfulness of your project. So I've listed here just some common key areas to consider in relation to your team management. I'm sure you're all aware that if these foundational aspects of your work are not functioning well, sometimes that can prevent the actual work or research from getting done. You know, attempting to have a solution-oriented approach to these barriers can sometimes go a long way. But we do recognize and acknowledge that within your own institution, there may be various offices that manage these aspects of a team member's experience. And we also acknowledge that as research administrators, you could be juggling a variety of roles. You know, each one of you join us today from your own context. And as we've learned, you know, it can be very specific, and even the smallest part of that context can really change how you're experiencing each of these areas of team member management, standardly known as human resource areas. Really, I'm just sharing this list to demonstrate factors that can play into team building and overall effectiveness. And I encourage you to consider each item and your current level of influence over it, just sort of planting a seed. And then in part 2 of our GAIN training, when we get into more of the post-award implementation of grants next spring, we will explore this further. But in the meantime, just start to be thinking about if you're aware of who controls these areas for your team or even just for yourself. Are there items on this list that could potentially improve? And could you help improve them? And if so, what might be the next steps to take in order to impact change in each of these areas more broadly? Some of the specific key areas of support as it relates to research administrators, as you work with principal investigators and partners to define and improve, include these 4 areas that I've outlined here: ensuring that team members have a clear scope of work, helping ensure that team members have the training that they need to achieve the outlined tasks, building an environment of trust and support, and providing appropriate tools for team success. So just unpacking each of these, I'll start with ensuring that team members have a clear scope of work. And this already gets into that cross-cultural communication because, you know, in the States, mostly we would call this a scope of work. But I know in a lot of other countries, it's more common to say terms of reference and maybe even some other phrase. You know, a lot of times the same thing has many names as you work across teams. But really, we're just talking about a document that serves as a summary of the main tasks expected for a certain position. So I have just a quick poll here that I'm going to launch. These are all anonymous polls, just a reminder. So I'm launching our first poll here. And the question is pretty straightforward. Do you feel that you have a clear scope of work or terms of reference for your current position? And the response options are, yes, I have a clear scope of work, terms of reference for my position. Another option might be that your current scope of work or terms of reference for your position is a little vague. And then some of you may not even have a scope of work or terms of reference for your position. So I'm just curious here, trying to gauge thoughts. You know, again, it's all anonymous. Just want to see where folks stand. All right, thank you all for responding to that. So I'm happy to report that it looks like most of the respondents do feel that they have a clear scope of work or terms of reference for their position, but there were a handful of folks that felt like theirs is a little vague and doesn't actually cover everything that they're working on. And some don't have a scope of work. So as we go through this slide, you know, and we offer some of the tips, keep these sorts of things in mind for how they might apply to your own context and what you might take back to your team to help improve operations within your grants office or your grants teams. Sometimes a detailed scope of work is included when a job opening is posted, but as I said, often they can be vague and not truly outline the tasks that a given position needs to undertake. And they start their job and they're left with a lot of question marks about what is expected of them. You know, and also as various grants might come in, which we do hope happens, team members' scopes of work might change over time. And really the key is trying to ensure that you and your team members are clear on exactly who is expected to do what and when. You know, in certain cultures, it can be really tricky to navigate these discussions for clarity on one's role because, you know, there might be fear of seeming like you don't know what you're doing. But truthfully, you know, I feel strongly that everyone deserves a clear scope of work or terms of reference, you know, and I hope that we're all working in places where you can feel comfortable asking questions if you aren't totally clear on what's expected of you on a day-to-day basis. So another aspect of team management that could be within your control is ensuring that team members have the training that they need to achieve their outlined tasks. We'll get into training more in our next module today, but a key factor that can really determine the success of a team member in their position lies in whether or not they were ever trained to do what's being asked of them. You know, I know sometimes the pace of work can be so fast that sometimes a team member might start in a position and just get thrown a bunch of work without anyone really sitting down with them, training them on how to do their position. So I have one more poll. Just start here, just a moment. I've launched the poll now, and the question is there currently a system within your institution to request additional job training that may be needed? The response options that I included were yes, there is a system and it works well. Yes, there's a system, but it doesn't work well. Or no, there's not a current system for requesting additional training. So again, feel free. I don't know who's responding what. So there's no judgment about your institutions here. This is a safe space. Okay, it looks like we have a little bit of everything here. Some folks do have a system that works well. And when we get into those training systems in part 2, please, I want you to contribute and help share with us what your systems are and how they are working well. But we do acknowledge that some folks have systems that don't work well. And there are also institutions that don't even have a system for requesting additional training. So I'll just share the results with you briefly. So again, this is just laying the foundation for our part 2 training where we'll get into some of these systems. But I think it's important to know what you're working with, and really taking this time to reflect on your own institutional context and how it could improve in these areas. So the next aspect that we'll look at is building an environment of trust and support. As mentioned in the relationship building presentation, as well as today in our communication discussions, a lot goes into creating an environment of trust and support. Hierarchies and difficult personalities can sometimes impact how well a team functions. And really establishing an agreed upon foundation of mutual respect, as well as a system for conflict resolution among your team, can go a long way toward building the type of environment that everybody wants to work among. So I'd love to know some ways in which your team has worked to build trust. So I'm going to continue on, but please feel free to pop in the chat if you feel like your team has a certain method of trust building that has really worked for you. You know, and sometimes it can be just as simple as having a discussion among the team and really speaking words to the respect that everyone needs to be treated with. But other people, I think, can really put the effort in towards building this environment of trust and support. So please feel free to place in the chat if you have any of these suggestions, and we'll come back to that at the end. And so then lastly, providing appropriate tools for team success is an area that sometimes we take for granted. But really, if you don't have the most basic of needs in terms of tools for team success, it can leave you stuck and not moving forward. You know, for example, in this day and age, trying to operate without access to a personal computer can be a real challenge. But, you know, we've had partners that don't have a computer. And I think a lack of awareness of that can really hold us back. And so being able to communicate what tools you need and getting help to acquire them, I think can go a long way. Other equipment like having a mobile phone with adequate credit can affect communication among team partners, you know, and I can just share from experience when I first started working cross-culturally, not even realizing that challenge of not having phone credit, so not being able to communicate with someone, you know, I think we really took that for granted. And so it wasn't until we realized that teams needed that support and we needed to build that project support into our budget, you know, our team in country didn't feel comfortable asking for that. And so it was really this disconnect that then we were able to bridge. And once they had those tools, you know, the level of collaboration was just improved so greatly. So, you know, just thinking about this is really just meant to spark consideration of what tools are needed for your team's success. And I encourage you to communicate those needs to your partners. And anytime there's a budgeting process, speaking them, you know, it's not a guarantee that these will all be allowable costs, but sometimes there are access to other funds, non-restricted funds that can help get a team fully equipped for success, whether it's software or improving access to internet. You know, all of these things can affect a team's performance. Also having standard operating procedures, like a filing system, be it paper or digital, for all project documents, you know, all of this ties into efficiency. We'll get into project tracking tools a bit later, but the main thing to remember here is the importance of assessing the needs of your team. And that can be done via a needs assessment among team members. And some of you may have already conducted needs assessments with your teams before. Some of you may have heard the phrase and find it just a little intimidating, but really needs assessments can be as simple as an email to the team asking, does anyone need anything? You know, it could be a meeting to discuss these things. It doesn't always have to be a super formal system. It's really more about the action of assessing what your team's needs are. Confirming the items within your power to address once you have those identified needs, and then assessing the potential for items outside of your power to address. You know, like we said, if you don't have the budget for it, maybe you could have a conversation with a partner to see if they could help support some of those needs. I see something in the chat. I'll have to come back to that. Let me just see the question here. Yeah. Okay, so just a review summary. I think we did pretty decent on time. I appreciate you all for bearing with me. We've covered a lot already, and we have 2 more modules to go. So we started with reviewing just some of these goals and roles of research administrators. Had some really great discussion on cross-cultural communication. And I think that that is an open discussion that we always want to continue having. So feel free to keep sharing in that realm. And then I've touched on some concepts of team management, again, that we will circle back to. But for now, I just wanted to, before we get into our bio break, just to see if anyone has questions. There was a long comment in the chat.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi.
Okay, so I just it's not about a question. I wanted to know how I can grade myself on the communication quiz. I think I'm
Yes. Yes. So if you were able to print it out, I think that is easiest. I didn't have a printer, so I was just using my PDF and making X's and O's. But there, look further, I think it's like page 6 or 7 in the attachment. They break down how to get your score. So you go through all of your responses that were check marks and circle all of those throughout the number grid. And then within each column, you count how many circles you had in each one. And then there's a page that kind of gives you a table for seeing which style was your dominant style. So I can work with you one-on-one to get it further, but it is in the PDF. If you scroll down, they kind of get into all the directions and then give really great descriptions of each communication style. So if there's anyone else that, I know a few folks in my group didn't have a chance to take the quiz, you know, I thought it was fun and interesting. So if you have some time, I encourage you to do that. Were there any other questions?
There's a comment in the chat from Sambiria that just comments on what you were saying about trust. And she says, trust in the workplace means your employees enjoy a culture of honesty, psychological safety, and mutual respect. They're proud of where they work and are more willing to go above and beyond for your organization. Trust in the workplace also helps employees feel secure in their jobs and in turn reduces turnover.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you basically just summarized everything we were trying to convey, Samiri. So maybe in part 2, you'll teach that section when we recap, because that's exactly right. You know, I mean, I don't think anyone wants to show up to work every day in an environment that feels uncomfortable, where there's a lack of trust, and especially at the pace that the grant world moves at, you really need to be able to rely on one another. So I couldn't agree more, Simbiri. Before we break for 5 minutes, we wanted to take a group photo, and it looks like, I think we're all on, if I got the total right. Let me stop sharing.
I think we're missing one person, but yes, everybody else should be here.
Okay. Well, I think for the sake of time, we will just hope that they will join while we get things set up. As we get into this next section, we're shifting gears just a little bit into project tracking and the evaluation of progress. I think maybe for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and get started. It's difficult to know if folks are back with us because most people have their video off anyways, and you can't tell me you're not here. So, so I'll go ahead and get started. I see something in the chat back. Thank you. We'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully anyone who's still on their break will be with us shortly. So as I've said, you know, we've explored the ins and outs of the pre-award processes, and we've shared a little bit today about how cross-cultural communication can sometimes pose challenges to those efforts in the pre-award processes. But another aspect that relates to grant preparation and also your daily working as a team more broadly is project management and the tracking and evaluation of progress. Just an overview for this module here involves covering the use of metrics to aid team effectiveness. So we'll briefly go over what a SWOT analysis is, a Gantt chart, a work plan, and an indicator plan. And several of these here, I included videos to watch beforehand. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on them. But again, if you want to dig deeper, I encourage you to watch those videos if you haven't already. And then if you still have questions, you know, we have the GAIN network, so you can always reach out and ask for a little more input. And then from there, we'll get into very briefly some online project tracking tools that can help with project implementation and helping you track the process for grant submission. So when we talk about metrics for project tracking, this could be used to refer to a wide variety of approaches to following your progress toward meeting your project goals. One basic metric to understand where your project or team stands is to conduct what's called a SWOT analysis. If you're not familiar with this, SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So in your analysis of these areas, you're really analyzing each of these aspects as it relates to your organization, or maybe even more specifically for your team, asking questions like, what do you do well? And what resources do you already have that you could leverage? And maybe digging deeper into some other questions related to weaknesses, like what needs improvement or what resources do you currently lack? When preparing a grant submission or considering a new research project, it can be helpful sometimes to conduct a SWOT analysis to assess the situation and identify your strengths, help you plan for the needed resources and your plans to strengthen any weaknesses that you identify, and then avoiding the pitfalls of certain threats that might exist that could delay or even prevent your project or research from happening. So this might look like a simple table This might be as simple as a table, or it could be something more involved, like a longer document that really writes out in depth all of your analysis of each of these areas. So again, we're not going to go very deeply into these areas. There are videos to back this up that you will all have access to, and we're always available for questions. So for the sake of time, we'll just move on into what's referred to as a Gantt chart. Again, encourage everyone to watch the video on Gantt chart if you haven't already. But I hope that if you have, it's laid the groundwork for what a Gantt chart is for anyone that may have been unfamiliar with it. They can be really common in the world of grant and research implementation. So a lot of you might already have experience with it. So I won't spend a ton of time, but essentially a Gantt chart is a type of bar chart that illustrates a project schedule for activities, really outlining each one as you see depicted here. So this type of chart lists the tasks to be performed on the vertical axis and the time intervals on the horizontal axis. So the width of the horizontal bars in the graph shows the duration of each activity. And I apologize if it's not super easy to see here. Hopefully, once you get the slides, you can kind of zoom in a little more closely and spend time with this if it is new to you. But Gantt charts illustrate the start and finish dates of the summary elements of a project. And as I said, there is a wide variety of project tracking charts that can expand on this, but a basic approach looks something like this. And when you're submitting a grant proposal, a lot of times funding agencies often want to see some form of a chart or a table or a timeline that demonstrates that your team has really thought through all of the project milestones that need to be reached in order to achieve your goals, and that you've kind of mapped out your time for how you can achieve all of those goals within the period that you're asking to be funded for. So not only are those mapped out by aims and goals of the project, activities or tasks, or even sub-activities and subtasks, but they want to see this timing of implementation and how things will play out. So in this snapshot of an example Gantt chart, it breaks down activities by quarters, so our 3-month blocks of time. And usually this level of information is sufficient for a grant submission. You know, just laying out your goals and your tasks, and then saying, we're going to do XYZ in the first 3 months of Q1 and then the next 3 months in Q2, for example. But, you know, I do wonder whether you think it would be helpful to use this chart to help manage daily activities in your project. You know, is having a plan for which month you're going to do something super helpful for your daily work, you know? Thinking about what might be more useful in your Gantt chart to help you track project management on a daily basis. So looking at this a little further, some teams decide to add a little more information into their Gantt chart, like adding in a column for the percentage of completion for an activity. So like in this one, you'll see that goal 1 here is only 10% done. And they added in a column to who they are assigning to be in charge of seeing that activity through. Still, this one is just broken down by quarters, but at least there's a little more information for managing the tasks. You have a person on the team who is responsible for the item, and you have a little bit of an indication of how your progress is going. But I still wonder, could there be more information added to this to make it easier to manage your day-to-day activities? And that's when you get into some of the more complicated Gantt chart templates. For daily tracking, you might choose to use a more complicated Gantt chart, such as one like this, that includes a lot more specifics, including the sort of micro level tasks and start dates and end dates for each one. Also still including the team members and the percentage of completion. But as you see here, this one really breaks down on a daily basis how someone plans to work to complete a certain activity. As your grants office creates systems for grant submissions, you might even want to consider something like this to use as a tracking tool to monitor your progress for completing all of the elements that we know exist now in a grant submission. Or maybe you have multiple grant submissions at once, and this type of tool is used to track each of them on this in the same document. Really, there are so many templates out there, and even software that automatically calculates progress levels based on formulas. I think that the key here is finding a tool that works for you and your team members, because even the most fancy of tools is useless if no one actually uses it, you know? And it could be unnecessary work creating something very elaborate if no one else on your team is able to really put it into practice. So I would say here, just know your own context, know that there's a lot of options out there, and you can always turn to the GAIN network for input on that if you feel that you could use it. So just moving right along, the third video for this module that I shared with you related to breaking down a work plan, or in some countries, it's referred to more commonly as a work breakdown structure. There are some subtle differences between the two. And as I said, there's a lot of terms used in the project management world that often refer to very similar documents. But another tool you might use for project tracking is what's called a work plan or a work breakdown structure for your current projects. Some folks might actually use a Gantt chart for project tracking, but they call it a work plan when it's a Gantt chart, you know. Anyways, you can refer back to these videos if you want to learn more about the idiosyncrasies, the differences between each of these. But in terms of your direct experience, I have a poll coming up that I will launch briefly. And I just really want to understand more about the experience that anyone has in either creating or following a Gantt chart, work plan, or work breakdown structure. Your response options here are yes, I have created and used one. Another option is yes, I have used one but not created one, or no, these are not tools that I have used in practice yet. Again, there are no wrong answers here. We're just trying to gauge where the experience levels lie so that we can better tailor part 2 as we dig into some of this in the post-award processes. I see some answers coming in here. Give it just a little bit more time. All right, wow. We are split. Sorry, I got a little bit stalled here. Share results. So it looks as though some of you have created and used one. An equal part has used one but not created one. And then others have not used these tools in practice yet. And again, we are all at various levels of our projects. And so there's nothing wrong with having not ever created any of this, because we've all been there for the first time at some point. And I appreciate that it can be intimidating at times, but really it's just about practice. And before you know it, you'll be creating these things in your sleep. So getting into the work plan, it's defined by Oxford as a proposed strategy or schedule for a project. It's a written document or digitally typed document intended to streamline a project and create a visual reference for the goal, objectives, tasks, and team members who are responsible for each area. So as I've mentioned, a grant submission typically involves following an outline of required sections, and depending on the funding source, some sort of work plan or work breakdown structure might be requested for your intended projects. These are less common with NIH funding, but extremely common with USAID funding and sometimes CDC funding, for example. So we just want to expose you to all of it. And then as you go for different funding sources, know that certain tools may apply and be more appropriate than others. Pardon me. So a work plan includes setting goals and aims and objectives, establishing team responsibilities for each of these, setting project timelines, and establishing a budget. As I mentioned, for most NIH funding, there are required aims and objectives as well as a research strategy plan, but you don't necessarily have to submit to them something as involved as what is depicted here. As you may recall from the pre-session video, if you were able to watch it, there are many ways to depict a work plan or a work breakdown structure. This is just another way that all of that information I mentioned might be displayed. There are so many templates online. Typically, if there isn't a formatted template provided for a grant application, your team is really free to design this in a way that makes the most sense for you and your team. What I've depicted here is what's referred to commonly as a work breakdown structure. Again, this is in the pre-session video, but it's more common in the UK and other areas with funding sources outside of the US. A work breakdown structure tends to operate like an organizational chart for your project activities, providing a broad look at all of the planned areas. And then, so as you see depicted here, this is really like a phase-based work breakdown that might exist for a construction of a house. This offers a broad view of the plan phases and high-level activities, but it doesn't really get into the specifics of how each one will get done. The difference between the two approaches is sometimes defined by a focus on activities in a work breakdown structure and a focus on the deliverables or a product in a work plan. But really, depending on the project and the funding agency, teams in both of these regions can have a merged approach to these documents and call them different names. You know, just as we've learned from our cross-cultural communication discussion, the real key here is to ensure that everyone is on the same page and that what you are outlining is coherent and makes sense. So long as a reader can understand what you're trying to convey, a lot of these little details don't matter as much. So there are some key elements that appear across the board, like numbering and subnumbering, to help a reader easily refer to different project phases or different aspects of what you're planning, especially for really large projects. Because if you don't number each of your activities, it can get really confusing for a reader when they want to refer to different aspects of your activities. So if you notice here on this slide, there are 5 different phases, and then there's sub-numbering between each of the activities under each of the phases. So like 1.1, 1.2. So that's something that I think is kind of standard across all of these tools to help you identify, as you go through 5 years of a project, which activity you're referring to where. Even within a budget, it can be really helpful. So just one final tip here for completing either document is to make each activity mutually exclusive, meaning no overlap between the tasks that you're writing, and completely exhaustive. So covering everything that you've planned in your project. So when you're writing up how you're going to do research, for example, in a grant submission, you really need to think about all the activities it will take, because that informs your budget. And it's very rare for the NIH to go back and give you more funds, as I think Donna shared in a previous session. So you really want to think through what are all the activities that we are going to have to do to achieve what our goal is, and what are the costs that relate to that. Making sure that you ask for as much money within the parameters of the notice of the funding announcement, that you're asking for a comprehensive amount of funding to fund a comprehensive amount of activities that you've laid out here. So lastly, I will get to a question section soon, but I'm just going to cover these measures of success. So once we've outlined a work plan or work breakdown structure as part of our grant application or project planning, we have to kind of think about how we will know whether or not we're succeeding in what we set out to do. You know, how will we quantify or measure project success? For research studies, oftentimes data variables and analysis can respond to a research question, but we may also need to know measures of project implementation success to see if we're on track for achieving what we set out to do. So, you know, thinking through some ways that we know if our project is successful or not leads to what's referred to as key performance indicators or measurable values of project effectiveness. Indicators can help individuals at all levels like focus their work towards achieving a common goal. And it can also help an organization understand whether or not they're achieving what they set out to do. And I remember when I first entered the grant world, I heard the term indicator thrown around everywhere, and no one really stopped to explain to me what an indicator was. And so once I learned the reason behind them and what they are, I found it much less intimidating. You know, it's true that for research studies, we might have a very specific set of data variables to be collected and analyzed, and they might serve as your indicators. But oftentimes when you're submitting a grant proposal that relates to a broader project outside of a discrete study, it will be necessary to outline which indicators you will track along the way of your project to help you evaluate if you've been successful at achieving what you've set out to do. And so for certain funding agencies, when they're reviewing your grant submission, they want to know how you're going to evaluate your activities. How are you going to be able to report to them on a regular basis your progress and what you've been able to accomplish? So you all might already have a ton of experience with indicators. In case this is new for everyone, I just wanted to include a few slides on them so that you'll have them to refer back to or for your future trainings that you conduct. But it's really important that indicators are well defined, and the process of defining indicators can be tricky. So one tool that you may have heard referred to, because I think that this acronym of using, SMART goals gets shared a lot, but that also applies to indicators. And so when you are defining an indicator or what measure you will use to monitor success, trying to find an indicator that uses this smarter approach, where, as you see here, making sure that your indicator is specific, first and foremost. An indicator should be a detailed, simple, and clear description of exactly what you want to achieve. So, for example, improve patient retention is a little too broad. A better indicator might be, or a goal would be to improve adult patient retention in ART services by 10% at the 6-month follow-up for patients. And then your indicator for that would be the patient data that comes from the records. And that would inform whether or not patient retention has met that goal. So secondly, indicators should be measurable. We want them to be quantifiable so that we can establish an exact definition of success. For so much of what we're trying to achieve in the grant world, it can be a little vague whether or not we are actually achieving our goals. And so oftentimes funders want to see you lay out a specific indicator, for better or for worse, that informs whether or not you are achieving success. So that leads us to the next one, which is ensuring that an indicator is achievable. I think you are all the best informants on whether or not an activity is realistic. And having an achievable indicator really ensures that individuals working towards them are motivated and challenged, but not burnt out. We really need to set realistic expectations with the stakeholders, project leadership, but also with the funding agencies. So you don't really want to set out an activity that isn't achievable. Lastly, just moving along here, we want to make sure that indicators are relevant and also time bound. By when will you see a certain change in the data or the variables? And then the added to the E and the R here for a smarter one includes evaluation. So regularly examining your indicator plan is a great way to ensure that you're still working towards the right objectives. And I have to say from experience that oftentimes indicators get changed by the funding agency even along the way. So this can be a moving target, but in an ideal situation, you would set your indicators in your grant submission and then follow that all the way through towards the end of project completion. And they wouldn't change, but sometimes they do, which leads us to the last item here, reevaluate, readjust. So you might consider reevaluating your indicators at specific time periods, maybe just taking a look halfway through the project. And as I said, sometimes a funding agency will come and change how an indicator is formatted. So I acknowledge that I just said a whole lot of really dense information. All of this is on your slides and all of it is in the notes. And again, we can come back to this in part 2. This is really just meant to introduce the concepts to you because they do at times apply to the pre-award process. Certainly they apply to the post-award. So we will circle back to this. I just want to give an introduction. So this is a sample indicator table here. Again, apologies for the small text. I just wanted to show how these details are oftentimes laid out. So to track our indicators, each one has a specific number, as we said, an indicator description, mapped out activities that will be tracked by that indicator. So that's where you see like the 4.1, the 4.2, and you can appreciate how it's helpful for every single activity to be discrete and have its own number for tracking. They have targets for each quarter and the year, the data source that the indicator data will come from, and a note of how frequently that indicator data will be assessed and how frequently you'll be reporting that indicator to the donor. So in this example, the organization wants to increase the number of hospitals that are reporting health outcome data using the DHIS2 database. So listed here, they include the activities that relate to this initiative. And their target is to get 75% of hospitals using this system in the first 2 quarters. Then by quarter 3, they want 100% of hospitals reporting patient data through that system. They plan to get this indicator data directly from the DHIS2 database, and they'll be assessing indicator progress monthly and then reporting it to the donor annually. So like I said, defining all of this can be tricky at times, and sometimes it gets changed, but we'll get into this further. But just for a breather, does anyone have any questions of any of these areas that I've covered, you know, getting into the Gantt chart, the work plan, and even here further into indicators before we move on? I know it was a lot of information. Okay, well, maybe I'll move on. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up here, you know, recapping this far in the course, we've mentioned the grant in progress timeline that we use for helping plan out all the required steps and related time needed to draft each part of a grant submission. Today, I added in some information on basic project tracking tools like a Gantt chart or a work plan. And we've just mentioned some of the metrics or elements involved in tracking effectiveness, like indicators. So it could be that your team operates just fine using one or all of those tools to guide and monitor your projects. However, some teams find that these static tools and documents can be somewhat cumbersome to keep current and for them to be a tool that is really helpful to the team. And over the years, there have been many online project management tools that were created to help keep up with the day-to-day activities of your team. As everything else I feel like I've mentioned today, we will go deeper into this in the second part of GAIN training as we get into the post-award. But since project management is also necessary during the pre-award phases, I'm just going to very briefly introduce these. So there, as I said, are a wide variety of online tools available for project management. Some of the most common free ones I've listed here, and you may be very familiar with some of these and some may be new. The Microsoft Office suite, I think, is very common for teams to use for email and calendar interface for teams, potentially using Box for storage. You know, there are a lot of aspects that come along with the Microsoft Office suite. I know a lot of the teams that we work with internationally have transitioned into using the Google service systems. So using Google Drive, Google Documents. They have a variety of features available from email to knowledge and information management tools like document storage and sharing documents between team members that can be really helpful. And then I've linked in here 2 other systems that can be really helpful. And these are both free systems. There is Asana and Trello. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to play the demo here, but when you get these slides, I do encourage you to just watch the brief demo video for each of them. I've worked in both of these. Our team has gotten into a pattern of using Asana more, but really it again always relates to what works for your team, and that just happened to be what worked for our team the best. They have a very easy to use language feature that can switch it all to Portuguese, and so that informed our decision, and that might not be relevant for your team. I want to just have a brief poll. Let me launch it for you. Okay, I'm launching now. And I just want to know, and you can select as many options as are appropriate here, which of the project management tools you have experience with. And so again, you can select all of the ones that you have experience with. I'm mostly asking this to inform the second half of our training so that I know which ones to spend more time on and which ones, you know, the team is very familiar with, what you might want to learn more on. Okay. Got quite a few answers here. Share the results. So it looks like the majority of folks are using either Google Docs, Microsoft Office Suite, potentially both of those. And some folks do have some exposure, some experience with Asana and Trello. I would be interested to know the others. For those of you who have used another one, if you wouldn't mind just popping that in the chat, just so that I can make note of it. And then some have used none of the above, which again is part of the process, right? I think is just determining what works best for your team. So in addition to all of these online project management tools, there are a myriad options available just for managing team communication. From your email inbox to your mobile phones, WhatsApp, Skype, Slack, Zoom, and all the other areas, including social media. It can really be a bit dizzying knowing where a team is going to communicate and what makes the most sense, you know? I think it is always a good idea to check in with your immediate team members, but especially those in other countries and other time zones, and confirm how they prefer to communicate and when they prefer to communicate. Just circling back to the topic of cross-cultural communication, it's really important to be honest about what works best for your team. You know, I can just share from experience with our team in Sierra Leone. Originally, we made the assumption that they would want to have meetings during business hours to protect, you know, their time outside of the office or the hospital. And it wasn't until, you know, asking them what worked best for them, we were surprised to learn that they actually preferred to have calls at, you know, 6 or 7 p.m. their time, because that allowed them to really just focus on work and their patients during the day. And nighttime was a better time to have a chat about the project. So, you know, again, just staying focused on your context and what makes the most sense for your project can really go a long way. So I feel like I've been talking a lot in this module. Apologies for that. But we've covered a lot. So just to review in this module, we have covered metrics to aid team effectiveness, touching on all the areas that you see here. And then we just dipped our toe into online project tracking tools to aid project implementation. And, you know, your feedback in these areas and what you want to learn more about in phase 2 will really help us tailor the training to what you want the most hands-on experience with. So With that, we have reached our next break, but before we break, I just wanted to ask if there are any questions. I'm seeing some comments in here. Trello is fantastic. I love it, Beatrice. And Sabina has used GrantVantage, and I'm not even familiar with that. So maybe we can have you give us a walkthrough of that in phase 2. Are there any other questions at all before we break? Speak now. I'm not going to say or hold your peace. This is an open space. You can always ask your questions. Okay, I think we are now starting on our final module. I appreciate you all for hanging with us today for an extra hour. We just wanted to cover all of these topics before we break for phase 2. And we will have some next steps at the end. So we needed this extra hour, but we appreciate your time for it. We've covered all of the exhaustive content in relation to the research administrator course thus far. And now we're kind of faced with the question of what do you do with it? You know, where do you go with the information that we've shared with you up until now? And I just wanted to give a reminder that the purpose of this course is really to provide a training of trainers, being all of you, that will then take this information back to your respective institutions and replicate this training, making adjustments to your local context and needs, obviously changing things that you need, adding in stuff that maybe we didn't cover, and really making it your own. And so this next module is going to dig into how one can go about setting up a training system for you and your institution. So in the module, we'll start by reviewing some of the main elements to consider in training program planning. Then we'll get into establishing an external training system among faculty and students and investigators to learn these beautiful skills that you've all been honing this month. And then establishing an internal training system among your team, which can be really helpful to avoid loss of institutional memory if your team experiences high turnover rates. So I have a poll here. This is the final poll. I've just launched it, and the question is, have you ever been involved in planning a training of any kind? 2 response options here. Yes, I have planned a training, or no, I have not yet planned a training. Okay, thanks to those of you who have already responded. So it looks like the bulk of you have planned a training before, which is great. Hopefully some of the tips that I'm about to share will just help you really polish that system that you've created. And for those of you who have not yet planned a training, I hope it can serve as a foundation to work from, knowing that, again, you have access now to everyone in this GAIN network, not just those of us at Vanderbilt, but really at all of these institutions, because we acknowledge that so many of you are very experienced in these areas. And we hope to just pull on that experience of everyone so that none of us have to reinvent the wheel here. So there are 3 main elements of training program design. There's pre-training aspects to consider, such as the administrators of the training, the location for the training, and the resources needed. There is the learning event or training itself. And then there are post-training elements, evaluating what has been learned, planning for how learning will be applied or reinforced through a potential network for follow-up. So key elements of the training, pre-training activities focus on, first of all, administration. So this is really thinking through who will design and lead the course, what will be the process for participant enrollment, for example, how will you handle the management of any participant evaluation? If you're designing new course content, this can be a long iterative process. And so plenty of advanced planning for that content creation will be needed as well. Next, consideration of the training site and the available space is helpful. Keeping in mind things like the comfort of your participants, the accessibility for folks that will be joining, and importantly, the power or internet situation, if you're relying on that for part of your training. And then really doing a test run through of the equipment. I mean, that is really one of these basic rules that I've been burned on in the past when I take for granted how well I might know the room or how to connect to the computer system. So I think just knowing your own training space can be really important, and going there to kind of check things out in advance can help avoid some of the pitfalls that often happen, you know, with the training. And then lastly, organizing the resources and content, all of the necessary supplies and materials to be covered, ensuring that a varied approach to sharing material for maximum participant engagement. If the training content is pre-existed, it might be worth the team reviewing it all just to make sure that it's appropriate for what you're trying to achieve in your training. Maybe refreshing some of the content or tweaking it, incorporating new content, you know, as you all endeavor to take this training on to investigators at your institution, for example, you know, thinking through this and looking at what we've done, changing it for what works best for your audience is really important. So in this next phase, looking at the training event itself, there are also some key elements that I'll outline here. It's important to consider the following areas. So logistics, organizing those supplies that we talked about, refreshments for participants, if that's included, and very obvious things like instructing the participants on how to get to the site. They can't join your training if they don't know how to get there. Thinking through engagement of the participants. You know, you want to make sure that the content and teaching approach is engaging for participants. Also tracking attendance for who is there. And we'll dig into that a little bit more, you know, in the future. And then lastly, looking at time management, really monitoring each lesson and module to ensure that the training stays on schedule and potentially adjusting as needed. Just as an example, I have a whole notepad here beside me of like where I'm supposed to be in this 3-hour training. And I've already made some adjustments and taken out some polls and taken out certain breakouts just to keep us on schedule and respect all of your time, you know? And so I think that tracking these things as you go along can be really important. Hopefully you have a team to do it. Like I have the lovely GAIN team here, but we recognize that for some of you, you might be on your own to plan your training for your institution. I mean, you're never on your own. You're a part of the GAIN network, but so getting into the training content itself, you should always start with the usefulness or objective of the course and its relevance to participants, followed by an explanation of how the course is structured and what the course will cover. So discussions can be a great way to have an interactive training experience. You know, as you might see, we've tried to incorporate that via breakouts in this training, using the chat and other moments, having the polls. These are all ways to engage the audience and help them really reflect on the material. But also it can be hard to keep your attention for 3 hours, you know, and so we've also included breaks and things like that. And we are also open for feedback. So, you know, no training is perfect. And certainly we have had hiccups along the way. So please also know that we want to hear your feedback. We are very open, and hopefully each training that you do will just continue to get better as you refine your process and you kind of live and learn. And, you know, it takes sometimes something to go wrong before you realize, you know, what you needed to do in the planning step. On content design itself, some other aspects that you'll want to consider when designing is whether or not the training will just be a standalone course or workshop that happens maybe in a day, or if it will be a series of courses that might require a little more planning of a curriculum. Making the decision about whether or not participants will receive certification at the end or potentially formal credit, if that is something that, you know, faculty members or investigators need, and if so, what that certification entails. You'll also want to consider what course information needs to be shared with participants beforehand, during the training, and after the training. So often the last stage of training design is creating a specific lesson plan on how you will outline, on how you will train on all of the outline content subject areas. And then lastly, looking at post-training key elements. We're really evaluating what has been learned from the training, considering how that learning will be applied or reinforced, all through a potential network for follow-up to reinforce the training content, building upon the skills learned, and encouraging training participants to continue supporting one another. So in this vein, we are going to have a breakout. I've been talking for way too long, and we want to engage with our training participants. So we will take a break now, and we want you to pair up and take a moment to share any experience that you've had with a successful training that you've attended. It could be a training that you've designed yourself that you feel went really well, that you want to share about. It could be a training that you were a part of, that you feel like certain elements just really resonated with you. Just want everyone to chat a little bit more about a successful training that you've been a part of, and what did the trainers do that made it so effective? And we want to take notes on that. So with that, I believe Hillary will break us up into groups. Let's see what's in the chat. That's right. Thank you for adding that question. So the question is in the chat if anyone needs it for a reference once we're in the group.
How much time would you like, Anne?
And if anyone didn't get to share their comments, we'll hopefully have a little time at the end. So now that we've covered some of the basic elements of planning a training, I just want to talk a bit about creating systems for routine training. You know, now that you're halfway to gain certification, full gain certification, and mostly done with part one, you'll all soon be faced with the expectation to recreate these trainings for relevant audiences. But just conducting a training one time with zero follow-up can sometimes fall short of reaching the desired goals or outcomes that you would like to see among participants. I know each of your institutions strive to offer a supportive grants office, and that can routinely provide support to researchers in the areas that we've covered and that we will cover in part two of the GAIN course. And really, this means we'll need to think about long-term about how training can be accessed and maintained, and how we'll assess the training needs of your researchers, your investigators, faculty, students, all of that moving forward. So this is what we mean when we refer to creating a training system. I'm talking about a process that becomes routine for your institution. And to start, we'll look at training that your team at the grants office can provide to investigators at your institution. We'll refer to that as external training. For example, you might decide within your team that once a year, all researchers will take part in a training on grant funding that includes an overview of the services your office can provide to them in that search for grant funding. So as you embark on setting things up, you'll need to work with your team at the grants office to consider how best to assess researcher training needs, potentially related to aspects of research administration, grant writing, or other specific training gaps or related required trainings or certifications that donors might require. How to create a routine schedule or system for training, or to have a routine platform or method for investigators to request a training that they might need. And then lastly, how to track trainees and their needs moving forward. So as we dig into assessment of training needs, if you haven't already thought of this, this is a step that most likely will be your first step when you go back to creating your training, because the needs will likely be different and the approach will be different depending on your context. It might be that you go back to your institution and your team and simply adapt these tools and create a training on understanding the components of research grant submissions. And you just announce the training to the email addresses that you have and you see who shows up. Alternatively, you may want to have a team meeting, maybe with a principal investigator that you work with. Maybe it's a dean if you're at a university, to really review everything that you've learned and jointly tailor trainings based on the needs at your institution. Some of you might want to send out a survey to all investigators or faculty to gauge their prioritized training areas and what their needs are. So as you and the people that you work with strive to create a training system, just remember the elements of training design that we covered in the earlier slides today related to that pre-training process, planning for the training event, and post-training. So whatever route you and your team decide to take in terms of assessing training needs, I just encourage you to also consider some of the required investigator trainings that exist under certain funding streams. So for example, the NIH requires all key personnel to have an active certification of human subjects training if you're embarking on human subjects research. A lot of you may be familiar with that already. Additionally, for NIH grants, all research trainees are required to receive a certain amount of training in responsible conduct of research. So for these types of trainings that are required by the funding agency, as you can imagine, there are already a variety of online portals that are available to get certification in that training. Some of these are free, others are paid, and some you could even create your own training so long as it meets requirements. So I've just listed a few here, and we can reach out on the side if you would like more information on these specific trainings. So thinking through, the importance of creating a routine training schedule or having some sort of method, we really want to be able to account for new investigators that might be coming into your institution in a given year that maybe didn't receive the training you did last year. Or it might be that the topic areas could use a refresher on certain skills. If your training was really brief, that might be the type of training that you'd want to give every year to just help investigators hone those skills, for example. Excuse me. Also, I think those of us who have worked with NIH grant funding are well aware that the training guidelines or the guidelines and their policies can change quite frequently. And so sometimes it's required to have additional trainings so that folks working with that funding know what the guidelines are, know what the changes are. So really, we just want to find efficiency so that the same types of trainings aren't happening in various departments or teams, when really having a training system where everyone is aware of what's going on can oftentimes make the best use of your resources. So even at Vanderbilt, among teams, we share when we're leading a training in case there are trainees, even at other countries, that could benefit from that. Or maybe we could design the training together, even if we have to give it in different countries, so that we are maximizing the use of everyone's experience and we're not just sort of operating in silos, So as we've been coming together this month to offer support in the area of grant administration, we also really want to create a network among all of you that can continue to grow and support one another. And so we really want to create this system where you can help one another, sharing tools together, and help track, I forgot to give you the rest of that information. And help track the trainees and their needs. So we are trying to keep in track with all of our participants, and we really want to hear about your needs. And so as you try to bring this forward, it's important for you to then think about that within your own institution. We like to do this to, as you see here, inform participants of new training opportunities, to be able to report to the funding agencies about the reach, because, for certain funders, this is a requirement and they want to know exactly who you've trained and when and how. And then by keeping in touch with your trainees, you really can watch their progress and oftentimes identify other gaps that might be needed for training at your institution. And then lastly, really helping the trainees network together, because that just improves collaboration. Sometimes it even might spark certain investigators to work together for a grant submission. And so really, we're just trying to help create a system for addressing all of this so that there is a little more organization and a little more of a routine for how your institution addresses these needs. So we've talked a little bit now about the external aspect as we're referring to it. And I'm just going to shift gears into, yes, definitely quickly shift gears into a concept of an internal training system. So I'm sure that a lot of you have had this experience, a time where a coworker or a team member announce that they found a new job and that they're leaving your institution. And maybe it catches you by surprise. It's like while we're happy for their career advancement, it can sometimes cause issues and delays in project activities or a loss of support or institutional memory when that team member leaves. So there are just a few areas that can help us offset the impact of team members that might have to leave the team. Those include assessing research administration, staffing, and managing human resources, creating redundancy in personnel skills so that there's not just one person who knows how to do everything, and training systems for sustainability so that training a new person is an efficient process. So as I mentioned, there can often be high turnover rates or circumstances where suddenly a team member you depended on for important tasks announces that they will be leaving the organization. This can be jarring to a project and might even lead to a period where things are kind of in disarray. But we're going to talk just a bit about these internal systems to ensure that everyone is sufficiently trained to do their tasks, but there's a little bit of redundancy. So making sure that you have the resources that you need to really achieve what you're setting out to do. So creating these redundancy and personnel skills means that if one person leaves, there's at least someone else at the institution that knows how to do that task. And then lastly, the training systems for sustainability involves creating items like standard operating procedures so that a new person coming on board can easily understand what is expected of them. So digging into each of these a bit further, similar to the steps of the external training, you can assess the training needs of your team in a formal needs assessment, or it might be more appropriate to just have a team meeting or send an email if that's more appropriate. We talked earlier about the importance of having a clear scope of work and identifying any training needs that a new team member might need. In terms of redundancy and personnel skills, as I said, it's important to ensure that there's always at least two people, ideally, that know how to perform a certain task. However, we do acknowledge that it's not always possible when resources and funding is limited and team members are already playing multiple roles. And this is when the training systems and the documentation internally among your team becomes the most important. So when you have a standard operating procedure or an SOP outlined, these are a set of step-by-step instructions that are compiled by an organization to help workers carry out their routine operations. So usually this is a document written in very plain, clear, concise language. Sometimes they might include like a workflow or chart, but it's really important to be very easy to understand step by step how you get a certain task done. That way in the onboarding process for a new team member, they can have a formal orientation, you can review their scope of work, and then you can review these standard operating procedures that are already laid out so that you don't have to rely on the team member who had to leave, who would have trained that person. You have this document that can sort of stand as their proxy. So listed out here are just some general steps to take when writing a standard operating procedure. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through them because I want to make sure that we have just a little bit of time for wrap up before folks start having to pop off, but you can return to this once you have the slides. So lastly for today, I just want to bring up the topic of knowledge management. Oxford defines this as the systematic management and use of knowledge, be it collective data, information, and the body of experience, all within an organization to enhance the performance of the organization. So this gets into how your team handles all of your project files, your standard operating procedures, even getting into finance records, the purpose of your grants office, as well as your institution more broadly, for this purpose, it's important to consider the current structure that you have for knowledge management and just see if there's any room for improvement. We'll explore all of this much further in part 2 of our GAIN training. But for now, I'd just like you to consider the questions posed here on this slide when you're reviewing them later and working to strengthen your systems. So, taking some time to reflect on how your team is currently maintaining project documents. Is there a system? If there is, who knows about it? Like, does everyone know how to access certain files? And then what are the strengths and weaknesses of the system? So I will just start to wrap it up for the sake of time. But just a brief review, we started out this module talking about training program planning, and then got a little into what I refer to as an external training system, and then touched on an internal training system among your team members. So we have reached the end of part 1 of our GAIN training. I know I can speak on behalf of the other directors. We have enjoyed this time together throughout the month, learning so much about the world of grant administration from you and everything that you've shared. We sincerely hope that we've laid the foundation for a network here that will allow us to continue to support one another. For the time being, that will be through the WhatsApp group. So if you, for any reason, are not in the WhatsApp group, please, go ahead and pop your number in the chat and we'll get you added in. I am going to open the floor for any final questions or comments about what we've covered today or any topic that we've covered this month. But before that, I just wanted to share a little bit about some next steps for the group. So I mentioned this very briefly earlier, but as we finish our session today, we'll be sending out a post-training survey. This mirrors the pre-training survey that you took, and we ask that everyone please complete it. Your receipt of your certificate depends on it. So when you have completed your survey, we will send you your certificate of completion of the GAIN training part 1. And we will also provide you a link to all of the resources that we've used. And so that includes the slides, key readings, links to the videos, that you've seen on the website. I also forgot to mention that for the SWOT analysis, I'm going to share a document for you to conduct, just a brief SWOT analysis of your own institution that will come into play in part 2. So all of this will be provided to you after completing the survey. And then I also wanted to just share an idea that we had. We haven't set a firm date, but we're looking around February of 2022, bringing the group back together to have a debrief on your experiences. We acknowledge that you're all going, you didn't physically come to Vanderbilt, but you will be returning back to your team with all of these experiences, and then having to start working with the material, laying out your own trainings and plans that make the most sense for you. And we want to hear about that, So in this debrief, it will give everyone a chance to share what they've done since this training, ask any questions about anything, and really help us to touch base before we start part 2 that will be after that next spring. So we'll be in touch to nail down those dates. But with that, I believe I have said everything that I wanted to say, and I will just open the floor for any questions. Holly, Donna, Hillary, please add in anything that I may have missed.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks everyone for your time. This was a lot of time, and we appreciate your supervisors for allowing you to get this training. Again, as Anne said, and Hillary pointed out, we're going to be sharing the post survey. It is anonymous, so please share what you liked, what you didn't like, what was useful, because all of that will be synthesized to help improve part 2. Also, we'll maintain the WhatsApp group. I love the idea that Renee brought up. I think we're going to start peppering you all with questions and sharing resources. But we really appreciate your time. We hate that we would have loved this to be in person, but we really love the idea that, you all cover, 9 countries and 10 plus institutions. And so we hope that you all can reach out with each other. Also, if you haven't noticed, on the GAIN website, we've built out the directory. And so you'll see your photo, your bio, and everyone's email. So please utilize that. And thanks so much. We're just really thrilled. This was such a success, and all due to you all and your engagement.
Thanks, you guys. We look forward to seeing you again next spring. I hope everyone has a wonderful, happy new year.
Yes, it'll be here before we know it. We just get like a little holiday break, and then we'll be back at it with the GAIN group.
Thank you so very much, all of
Thank
you,
you so
and
much.
Polly,
Bye-bye.
Hillary.
Have a good one.
Donna.
James.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Happy
Bye.
holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Wish you a pleasant
Thank you so
Christmas
much.
holiday.
We will utilize what you have taught us, actually.
I hope so.
So much. We'll do our best.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Leonard.
It's not sweat.
Hey.